Among the normative theories that tell you what you should and should not do, we have utilitarianism, which is hedonistic because it's telling you what you should do is seek pleasure, avoid pain for not only yourself, but everyone that you're counting. And whatever you do is justified so long as the consequences are good. The means justify the ends. Let's discover Jeremy Bentham's theory of utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham, The Principles of Morals and Legislation, Chapter 1, Section 1. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. In other words, it's in our human nature to be ruled and governed by the master of pain and the master pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. In other words, pain and pleasure tell us or indicate for us, give us the signals of what is right and wrong, of what we ought to do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong. On the other hand, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. So we're told two separate things. These masters, pain and pleasure, both explain why something comes about by being able to connect causes and effects, and also they prescribe what should happen, because pain and pleasure are the standards of how we ought to go about things. So pain and pleasure describe how things go, and they prescribe how things should go. They are masters. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. Every effort we can make to throw off our subjection will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. Subjection is to be the subject of some, to submit to something else like a sovereign master. So when we try to show that we are not under the submission, not subjects of pain and pleasure, we'll just realize by its demonstration, by confirming that we can't do something other than what they tell us. In words, a man may pretend to abjure their empire, but in reality, he will remain subject to it all the while. Meaning, we might try to pretend like our governor is not pain and pleasure, but in reality, it is. The principle of utility recognizes this subjection and assumes it for the foundation of that system, the object of which is to rear the fabric of felicity by the hands of reason and of law. So far, we've just been told what good or value the principle of utility has. It has the ability to follow the laws of reason because it recognizes that we human beings are the subjects of pain and pleasure. We haven't been told the definition. We don't know what the principle of utility is. That comes sections later. But right now we're being told that whatever the principle of utility is, it recognizes that we humans, each one of us, are subjects, are submissive to the master, the governor, pain and pleasure. So according to Bentham, to repeat, every effort that us humans have put in to show that we're not just governed by pleasure and pain, or we're not chiefly governed by pleasure and our pain, shows up in the end that we really are just and chiefly governed by our pleasure and pain. So he says, we might as well accept that. That's our nature. For human beings, our only governor is pleasure and pain. And just make that the standard. Let's fess up, own it, and call that the standard of morality. the basis of morality, the standard, the ruler to use to judge whether an action is good or bad, is whether it produces pleasure or avoids pain. In section 3, he tells us that by utility, he means the ability of something to increase pleasure. The property in any object where it tends to produce, to create, to make, benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, happiness. Notice that there's no definitions of what counts as happiness, or whose happiness are we considering. By utility is meant that property in any object whereby it tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness, or to prevent the happening of mischief, pain, evil, or unhappiness to the party whose interest is considered. If that party be the community, then we're considering the happiness of the community. If the particular individual who we're considering is the individual, then we're considering the happiness of that individual. So Bentham is giving us the ability to decide. When we're trying to figure out what action would have the best consequences for the individual or the community, it's up to us to decide who are we considering. Is it the individual or is it the community? But maybe there's no difference, because in section 4, he says the interest of the community then is what? The sum of the interests of the several members who compose it. So there's a lot going on here. On one hand, everything goes back to what's best for the individual. Section 5 says that it's in vain to talk of the interests of the community without understanding what is in the interests of the individual. It makes it sound like you as an individual matter more than the community. But then in section 6, he shows us that the other is also true. That an action may be said to be conformable to the principle of utility when the tendency it has to augment the happiness of the community is greater than any it has to diminish it. So what's happening here? How do we have what looks to be opposing things? Either the individual is more important than the community, or the community is more important than the individual. He's showing us in the background here that the individual members, their interests make up the total sum of the interests of the community. And the value of the community is the total number of all of the individuals added together. So what's happening here is a two-way street. Actions promote the community's interest when the action tends to promote the interests of the individual. Then swap it. Actions tend to promote the interests of individual members when actions promote the community's interest. But how did we get there? We started here with the idea that people are governed only by pleasure and pain. And then he thinks that whatever by nature governs us is exactly what we should have as our standard. So putting these two thoughts together, we get the idea that pleasure and pain ought to govern us. In other words, that morality is determined by pleasure and pain. Then he simply adds the idea that the moral community is composed by individual members. In other words, the total interest of the community is the sum of the interests of the individual members. And then we get this idea that it's a two-way street. When an action is best for the individual or best for the community, then that action is the moral action. And by best, we mean the one that will increase the most amount of pleasure for whoever is considered. In section 10, he explains what exactly he means by this being the rule. Of an action that is conformable to the principle of utility, one may always say either that it is one that ought to be done, or at least that it is not one that ought not to be done. In other words, if I'm trying to do what's best for me or best for my community, you should let me. In fact, you should not tell me that I should not do that. According to Jeremy Bentham, there's no way that he or anybody else could prove that the principle of utility really is the right standard to use to judge whether an action is the right action. He goes through some other options, and he ends with a rhetorical question. If there is a standard that you want to use to judge actions other than the principle of utility, would that principle even be valuable?